I found out I was excluded from my own life at a Christmas party I was never invited to. The proof arrived by accident in the form of a photograph sent to the wrong group chat at exactly 6:47 in the evening. My phone buzzed while I was standing alone in my kitchen, stirring a pot of soup I had made for one. On the screen was a long dining table. Glowing under chandelier light, crystal glasses raised a decorated mansion in the background. And at the center of it all, my husband's children, their spouses, their children, and a woman sitting in my seat. The caption read, "Merry Christmas from all of us." All of us did not include me. I am Evelyn Hartwell. I am 61 years old. I have been married to Leonard Hartwell for 17 years, his second marriage, my first and only. He built a manufacturing company from nothing and sold it 5 years ago. We live in a quiet, gated community outside Hartford, in a house that is legally in both our names. Or at least I believed it was. That photo cracked something open in me that had been quietly aching for years. Leonard's children had always been polite in the way people are polite when they are waiting for you to disappear. His daughter Claire smiled without warmth. His son Matthew spoke to me like a colleague he tolerated. Holidays were scheduled around me, not with me. Thanksgiving dinners where I was asked to arrive late because the seating was complicated. Weddings where my name was not on the invitation, only added later by Leonard himself. Family drama, wrapped in silk excuses. But Christmas was different. Christmas had always been at our house, except this year. Leonard had told me he was too tired to host, that his children wanted something smaller, that we would do something quiet together, just the two of us. He had kissed my forehead that morning and left early, saying he needed to meet his lawyer about year-end paperwork. And there he was, in the photograph, wearing the sweater I bought him, smiling, with them, with her. I zoomed in on the woman beside him, younger than me, dark hair, her hand resting on Leonard's arm as if it belonged there. I called him, straight to voicemail. I sent a single message, "Where are you?" 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Minutes later, my phone rang. "Evelyn," he said, already defensive. "You were not supposed to see that yet." "Not supposed to see what?" He sighed, the sound of a man exhausted by consequences. "The family dinner," Claire insisted. She said it would be easier without tension. "Without me? You know how sensitive they are," he said. This was not personal. Everything that excludes you is always framed as not personal. I asked him who the woman was. There was a pause, too long, loud enough to hear the truth forming. That is when I learned her name was Vanessa, that she worked with his former company, that she had been helping him with investments, that she had been around longer than I thought. "How long, Leonard?" Another pause, long enough to end a marriage. I hung up without saying goodbye. My hands were shaking, but my mind was suddenly very clear. This was not just infidelity. This was betrayal layered with planning. A toxic family closing ranks. A husband quietly rewriting history while I was still alive. I walked into my home office and opened the file cabinet Leonard had always told me not to worry about. Inside were folders labeled Trust Amendments, Asset Transfers, and one that made my stomach drop. Will Revision Draft, dated 3 months ago, and my name was nowhere on the first page. I stood there in the quiet house, the Christmas lights still blinking on the tree I had decorated alone, and understood something important. They were not just excluding me from dinner. They were excluding me from the future, and they thought I would never notice. They were wrong, because that night I did not cry. I started reading, and by the time Leonard came home, I had already decided that if they wanted me erased, I would make sure the truth was impossible to ignore. I closed the folder, turned off the light, and waited. The first rule of revenge is silence. I did not confront Leonard. When he came home after midnight, smelling of wine, and false cheer. I did not mention Vanessa. I did not mention the will. I kissed his cheek, asked if the meeting went well, and watched his shoulders relax as he believed the lie had held. Inside, something else was forming. I had spent my career as a compliance officer for a medical supply company. For 28 years, I audited contracts, tracked paper trails, and learned how people hid things when they believed no one was looking. I knew the difference between a mistake and a manipulation. What Leonard and his children were doing was not sloppy. It was methodical. Over the next few weeks, I observed. Leonard took more calls in the garage. Claire began stopping by unannounced always when I was out. Matthew's wife unfriended me on social media, then blocked me entirely. Vanessa appeared in conversations as an afterthought, a consultant, a helper, never named directly. I smiled, I cooked, I listened, and I documented everything. Bank statements showed transfers into a trust I had never signed. Property tax records revealed a mansion in Vermont, purchased under a limited liability company, tied to Leonard's former lawyer. Emails, when I finally accessed them, showed discussions about inheritance planning, about protecting assets from potential disputes. From me, the betrayal was no longer emotional. It was financial, legal, precise. I made an appointment with my own lawyer, a woman named Judith Klein, who had once dismantled a corporate board with a stapler and a smile. I did not tell her how I felt. I showed her facts. She leaned back in her chair and said, "Evelyn, they think you are excluded, but you are still married. That gives you leverage." "How much?" "Enough to change the story," she said, "but only if you are willing to let it get uncomfortable." I was past comfort. The opportunity came at Easter, when Claire hosted a brunch at her new mansion. An invitation arrived, addressed to Leonard only. He pretended not to notice. I did. I sent Claire a message, polite, cheerful, looking forward to seeing everyone. She replied an hour later, "Oh, I thought Dad told you. It is just immediate family." I stared at the words immediate family and felt something steady settle into my spine. I wrote back, "Of course, I understand." And then I forwarded the message to Judith. The confrontation did not happen at Easter. It happened at the wedding. Matthew's daughter was getting married in June. Invitations went out. Leonard's name was printed. Mine was handwritten in smaller ink beside it. Judith smiled when she saw it. "They are testing boundaries," she said. "Let them." At the rehearsal dinner, Vanessa was there. Wearing a dress I recognized from Leonard's credit card statement. She met my eyes without shame. That was when I knew she believed she had already won. The next morning, before the ceremony, Leonard received an email from Judith. Subject line, "Immediate family." Attached were copies of trust documents, property transfers, and a formal notice of spousal review. The timing was intentional. By the time Leonard found me in the hotel lobby, his face was pale, his hands shaking. "What did you do, Evelyn?" I looked at him calmly. I asked questions. "You gave answers to everyone but me." The wedding bells rang somewhere above us. "This is going to destroy the family," he whispered. I leaned closer. "You destroyed it when you decided I did not belong in it." He reached for my arm. I stepped back. Upstairs, guests were gathering. Downstairs, the truth had finally arrived, and I had only just begun. If this story resonates with you, stay with me. What happened next did not just change my marriage. It changed who held power in that family forever. The wedding went on without me. I stayed in the hotel room while Leonard went upstairs alone, carrying the weight of a truth he could no longer outrun. From the balcony, I could hear music drift through the summer air, soft laughter glasses clinking. Celebration built on exclusion always sounds hollow once you know how it's made. I did not cry. I made tea, using the tiny electric kettle, and opened my laptop. Judith had warned me. Once they realize you are aware, they will accelerate. People who manipulate do not stop. They rush, and rush they did. By the time Leonard returned that night, his phone was buzzing nonstop. Claire, Matthew, the lawyer, Vanessa, though he did not answer her call in front of me. He sat on the edge of the bed, loosened his tie, and finally looked at me like a stranger. "You blindsided me," he said. "No," I replied quietly. "I stopped letting you blindside me." He rubbed his face. "Claire is furious. She thinks you are trying to embarrass the family." I looked at him. "I think your family has been embarrassing me for years." He flinched. That reaction told me everything. Leonard admitted nothing outright. He spoke in circles. About pressure, about keeping the peace, about how his children never accepted me, how Vanessa was easier, how I did not make demands. "You never asked for anything," he said, as if that were a flaw. That night, I slept on the couch. The next morning, I booked a separate flight home. Within days, the retaliation began. Claire sent a letter accusing me of manipulation. Matthew emailed Leonard insisting he protect the estate. Vanessa posted photographs online from the wedding, carefully cropping Leonard's hand, where it once rested on my back, replacing it with hers. And then something more dangerous happened. Leonard moved money. Judith called me immediately. Her voice was calm, but tight. "He is attempting to restructure the trust, quietly. Before anything is filed." "Can he do that?" "He can try," she said. "But it will look very bad." "Good," I replied. That was when I stopped observing and started acting. I requested copies of every joint account. I filed for a formal accounting. I froze discretionary transfers using spousal consent clauses Leonard had assumed I would never read. And then I did something unexpected. I invited Claire to lunch. She arrived, guarded, impeccably dressed, eyes sharp. We sat in a quiet restaurant overlooking the river. "I am not your enemy," I said first. She laughed. "You are exactly that." I nodded. "Fair enough. But enemies do not usually offer transparency." I slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of trust drafts, the Vermont property deed, emails referencing asset protection from spouse risk. Her face changed as she read. "You knew," she said slowly. "I know now," I replied. "And I will know more." She closed the folder. "What do you want?" "The truth," I said. "Because if I do not get it from you, I will get it from a judge." Her jaw tightened. "You are going to destroy everything my father built." "No," I said. "I am going to expose what you did with it." Silence. Then, unexpectedly, she spoke. "Vanessa was not supposed to be permanent," Claire said. "She was a solution, a way to transition Dad out of the marriage cleanly." I felt something cold spread through my chest. "Cleanly. You were already planning my removal." She did not deny it. "You were always temporary," she added. "You were never blood." I stood up, paid the bill, and looked down at her. "Neither is greed," I said, "and it still destroys families." That afternoon, Judith filed a motion for injunctive relief. By evening, Leonard was served, and by morning, the power dynamic in that family had shifted in a way none of them could reverse. The courtroom was colder than I expected, not physically, emotionally. Leonard sat at the defense table, flanked by his attorney. Claire and Matthew sat behind him, rigid, rehearsed. Vanessa was not there. She never was when consequences arrived. Judith stood beside me, a quiet presence, radiating control. The judge listened patiently as arguments were presented. Allegations of spousal exclusion, attempts to transfer assets without disclosure, evidence of coordinated planning. Leonard's attorney tried to frame it as misunderstanding, family drama, hurt feelings. Judith dismantled that in minutes. "This is not emotion," she said. "This is math. This is timing. This is intent." The injunction was granted. Leonard was prohibited from altering trusts, transferring assets, or modifying his will without court approval. The judge looked directly at him. "Mr. Hartwell, you should have involved your spouse from the beginning." Leonard did not look at me. Outside the courthouse, Claire confronted me. "You think you have won?" she said. "This is not over." I met her gaze. "It was over the moment you decided I was disposable." The real shift came days later when Judith discovered something buried in a subsidiary ledger. Leonard's former company sale had included deferred compensation, funds set aside under specific conditions that were violated when Leonard began diverting money to the Vermont property. It was not just betrayal. It was fraud. Judith smiled when she explained it to me. Not kindly, with respect. "They crossed a line," she said, "and they did not even know it existed." Leonard called me that night. "Evelyn, please," he said. "We can fix this privately." I sat in the dark living room, listening to the man who had erased me try to negotiate. "I do not want private anymore," I said. "I want accurate." Vanessa left him within the week. Not dramatically, efficiently. She took jewelry. She took cash. She disappeared. Claire blamed me publicly. Matthew retreated completely. Leonard stayed in the house, silent, aging, visibly in daze. One evening, I found him in the study, staring at an old photograph of us. "I never thought you would fight," he said. "I never thought I would have to," I replied. The filings continued. Discovery began. Emails were subpoenaed. Witnesses named. The family that had excluded me now depended on my silence. They would not get it, because revenge is not loud. It is patient. And the next chapter would make sure they understood exactly what exclusion costs. Discovery has a sound. It is the soft whir of a scanner late at night. The click of a keyboard when a sentence you were never meant to read appears on the screen. The sharp inhale you make when you realize the betrayal was not impulsive, but scheduled. Judith warned me not to read everything alone. I ignored her. I sat at my dining table with stacks of documents arranged by date, by sender, by intent. Emails between Leonard and Claire. Memos drafted by Matthew. Calendar invites marked private. And threaded through all of it, Vanessa's name appearing months earlier than Leonard had admitted. There was one email that stopped me cold. From Claire to Leonard. Subject line: timing. "We should wait until after Christmas. She is calmer when she thinks she is included. Once the will is finalized, everything else becomes easier." I read it twice. Then a third time. They had not just excluded me. They had used inclusion as sedation. I felt the emotional wound open fully then. Not dramatic, not loud, just deep. The kind that forces you to accept that the people you loved were capable of managing your emotions for their convenience. Judith called while I was still staring at the screen. "They are panicking," she said. Matthew's lawyer reached out. "They want to settle." "Already?" I asked. "Already. They underestimated you." We scheduled a settlement conference for the following week. Neutral office, long table, bottled water no one would drink. Leonard arrived, looking older than his years. Claire came armed with confidence she no longer quite believed in. Matthew avoided my eyes entirely. Vanessa was absent again. Always absent when accountability entered the room. The mediator spoke about compromise, about preserving family relationships, about moving forward. I listened politely, then slid a printed email across the table. "Timing," I said. Claire's face went pale. "You were planning to erase me while pretending to include me," I continued. "That is not a misunderstanding. That is manipulation." Leonard tried to speak. I held up my hand. "I am not here to negotiate feelings. I am here to correct facts." Judith outlined our position. Restoration of my full spousal rights. Immediate reinstatement in all estate planning. Financial penalties for unauthorized transfers. And one condition that made Claire's jaw tighten. Independent oversight. "You want control," Claire snapped. "No," I said. "I want transparency. Control is what you abused." The mediator suggested a break. In the hallway, Leonard approached me quietly. "I loved you," he said. I looked at him, really looked. Love without respect is not love. It is entitlement. When the session resumed, Claire agreed to terms she would have rejected months earlier. Not because she believed she was wrong, because she finally believed she could lose. The agreement was signed that afternoon, but that was not the end. Because the next morning, Judith called with a new development. "Evelyn," she said, "they missed something." "What?" "The deferred compensation funds. There is more exposure than we thought." And Matthew signed off on it. I closed my eyes. How bad? Bad enough that the company's buyer might get involved, and bad enough that Leonard's name is now attached to a potential civil claim. I felt something shift. This was no longer just family drama. This was professional collapse. And it was about to escalate in a way none of them had prepared for. The letter came from the buyer's legal team, thick and formal, addressed to Leonard, but copied to me. It alleged breach of representations made during the sale of the company, improper diversion of funds, failure to disclose material changes in asset allocation. Translation: Leonard had signed documents he no longer understood, relying on Matthew and Claire to manage details they had quietly manipulated. Judith was calm when she explained it. This is where karma stops being poetic and starts being procedural. Leonard was summoned for deposition. So was Matthew. Claire was listed as a person of interest. And suddenly, the family that once decided I was unnecessary needed me very much. Leonard asked me to attend the deposition with him. For support, he said. I agreed. Not for him, for myself. The conference room smelled of coffee and anxiety. Leonard's hands shook as he took the oath. Matthew looked hollow, like a man who had finally realized the cost of loyalty to the wrong narrative. The questions were precise. Dates, signatures, intent. Did you authorize this transfer, Mr. Hartwell? Leonard hesitated. He looked at Matthew. Answer the question, the attorney said. I did not understand what I was authorizing, Leonard said quietly. That sentence ended something. Not just the deposition. The illusion of control Claire had built her identity on. Outside, Claire confronted me in the parking lot. You enjoyed this, she accused. I shook my head. I endured it. There is a difference. You could have protected him, she said. You could have covered for us. I stepped closer. I protected myself. You were never part of that equation. The buyer's claim settled quietly months later. Leonard paid. The trust absorbed losses it should never have had. The mansion in Vermont was sold under pressure. The family's lifestyle shrank visibly. Leonard moved into the guest room, then into a rented condo. We did not divorce immediately, not because I hoped, because timing matters. One night, he asked me if there was any way back. I answered honestly, you excluded me when you thought I was weak. I cannot unsee who you became when you believed I did not matter. I filed for divorce the next morning. The settlement was clean, fair, final. On the day it was signed, I stood in the empty house and listened to the echo. This was not victory. This was release. But the final reckoning had not yet arrived, because the people who exclude you rarely expect to be remembered. And I was done forgetting. After the divorce papers were filed, silence settled in like dust. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that reveals what was always broken once the noise stops covering it. I moved out of the house we had shared and into a smaller place closer to the river. 2 bedrooms. One for me, one for the version of myself that had finally stopped apologizing. I furnished it slowly, deliberately. Nothing inherited, nothing chosen by committee. Every object was mine because I decided it belonged. That was when the phone calls started. Not from Leonard, not from Claire, from people who had been watching quietly. A former executive assistant from the company asked to meet for coffee. Then a junior accountant. Then a woman from human resources who had retired early under a cloud she never understood. Each conversation followed the same rhythm. hesitation, a glance around the room, then truth. They told me about backdated approvals, about meetings where my name was mentioned as an obstacle, about how Claire had been positioning herself as the inevitable successor long before Leonard sold the company, about Matthew's role as the quiet executor of decisions he pretended not to make. And then one of them said something that changed the shape of everything. "They thought you were the only one who might stop it," she said. "That's why they pushed you out first." I went home that night and opened a new document. Timeline. I began to write. Dates, names, actions, patterns. I did not embellish. I did not speculate. I documented. Judith reviewed it days later and leaned back in her chair. "This isn't just a personal record," she said. "This is leverage." "Against whom?" "Against the narrative," she replied. "The one where they paint you as emotional, vindictive, unstable. This proves you were strategic, patient, and right." The opportunity to use it came sooner than expected. Leonard collapsed at a charity gala 3 weeks later. Not dramatic. No scandal. Just a quiet medical emergency that reminded everyone how fragile the center of that family really was. Claire called me from the hospital. "They're asking questions," she said, "about the trust, about decisions Dad doesn't remember making." I closed my eyes. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "You know him better than anyone," she said. "They want to understand his intent." Intent, the word tasted bitter. "I will not rewrite history for your convenience," I said, "but I will tell the truth." That was all they got. At the hospital, I stood at Leonard's bedside and watched the machines breathe for him. He looked smaller, less certain, a man stripped of the structures that once protected his choices. He opened his eyes briefly. "I thought you would protect me," he whispered. "I protected the marriage," I replied softly. "You dismantled it." When he recovered slowly and unevenly, the questions did not stop. The buyer reopened inquiries. The trust administrator requested clarification. Claire's authority was questioned for the first time in her life. And then the board of the buyer's company did something unexpected. They invited me to speak, not as Leonard's ex-wife, as a witness to the culture that allowed exclusion to become policy. I stood in front of a room full of executives and told them exactly how power shifts when one voice is removed. I did not name names. I did not need to, because by the end of it, Claire's influence had quietly evaporated, and she knew exactly who had undone her. The confrontation came on a Sunday afternoon. Claire showed up at my apartment without warning, standing in the hallway like someone who had lost the map to her own authority. "You enjoyed watching it fall apart," she said. I stepped aside and let her in. She paced, always pacing when she was losing control. "You positioned yourself as the moral center," she accused. "You made them listen to you." I poured myself a glass of water. I told the truth. Listening was their choice. She stopped pacing, looked at me directly. "You were never meant to be permanent," she said. "You were a chapter. Dad was always ours." There it was, the belief that had justified everything. I nodded slowly. "And you believed that gave you permission." She clenched her fists. "You knew how to play the victim?" "No," I said calmly. "I learned how to stop playing it." She laughed bitterly. "You think this is karma?" I met her eyes. "No. Karma is impersonal. This is consequence." Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and went still. "What I asked," she swallowed. "The trust committee wants to audit the amendments independently." I said nothing. "They want your documentation," she added quietly. I tilted my head. I already gave it to them. The silence between us stretched. "You planned this," she said. "I planned to survive," I replied. Everything else followed. She left without another word. 2 weeks later, Claire resigned from every board she sat on. Publicly, it was framed as a desire for privacy. Privately, everyone understood. Leonard moved into assisted living. Matthew relocated out of state. The family that once closed ranks to exclude me, now barely functioned as a unit. And me, I started teaching a seminar once a month. Women over 50. Topics included financial literacy, estate awareness, and how exclusion often begins disguised as concern. They listened. They asked questions. They took notes. One woman stayed after and said I thought I was imagining it. I smiled gently. You rarely are. On Thanksgiving that year, I received an invitation from Leonard. Simple, handwritten, no assumptions. If you would like to come, no pressure. I folded it and placed it in the drawer. Then I cooked dinner for myself and invited friends who knew exactly who I was without explanation. As we ate, laughed, and shared stories, I felt something settle that had nothing to do with revenge. Belonging, not because I was included, but because I chose where I stood. And the story was not finished yet, because the final chapters are never about what you take back. They are about what you refuse to give away ever again. The letter arrived on heavy cream paper, the kind used when someone wants to sound dignified while asking for mercy. It was from Leonard's new attorney, not Judith, someone younger, someone strategic. Leonard wished to revise his will. Again, this time he wanted my presence. I read the letter twice, then once more out loud, listening for the subtext. It was there, threaded between polite phrases and legal language. Regret, fear, the quiet realization that exclusion had consequences that could not be undone by apologies. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I drove to the river and sat in my car, watching the water move past the dock. I thought about Christmas lights blinking in an empty house, about Vanessa's hand on Leonard's arm, about Claire's voice saying you were always temporary. I thought about how often women my age are expected to be gracious when they are wronged, mature, understanding, willing to absorb damage for the sake of peace. I called Judith. You do not owe him closure, she said. But if you go, you control the room. That was enough. The meeting took place in a private conference room at Leonard's assisted living facility. He looked smaller than I remembered, frailer. The man who once decided my worth without consultation now needed permission to sit upright for more than an hour. Claire was there. Matthew joined by video call. The new attorney arranged papers carefully, like props in a play that had already lost its audience. Leonard spoke first. I made mistakes, he said. I listened to the wrong people. I said nothing. I want to make things right, he continued. I want to include you, properly. Include. The word landed differently now. The attorney slid a draft across the table. I skimmed it without touching. I did not need to read the details to understand the intent. Leonard wanted absolution wrapped in legal ink. I looked at Claire. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes avoided mine. This is about legacy, she said finally. About preserving family. I leaned forward. Whose family? Silence. Matthew's voice crackled through the speaker. We can all move on if we do this. Move on. The phrase people use when they want the past buried without being examined. I sat back. I am not here to move on, I said. I am here to be accurate. Leonard's hand trembled on the table. What do you want, Evelyn? I met his eyes. I want my name restored not as charity, but as acknowledgement. I want the record to reflect that I was excluded intentionally. And I want a clause that prevents your children from altering this again without judicial review. Claire stood abruptly. This is punishment. No, I replied calmly. This is protection. The same thing you claimed to want. The attorney hesitated, then nodded slowly. He understood the leverage. Leonard closed his eyes. Do it, he said quietly. The agreement was revised, signed, filed. As I left, Claire followed me into the hallway. You won, she said. Not bitter, tired. I shook my head. I stopped losing. That night, I slept deeply for the first time. first time in years. But peace, I learned, often unsettles people who thrived on imbalance. And the backlash came swiftly. The backlash did not come from Leonard. It came from the narrative. Within weeks, whispers began circulating. That I had manipulated a sick man. That I had coerced changes. That I was vengeful, calculated, cold. A local columnist published an opinion piece about family disputes turned ugly. No names, but enough detail for anyone paying attention. Judith called me that morning. They are trying to rewrite the story, she said. Again, I smiled to myself. Then it's time to publish the footnotes. I did not respond publicly. I never do when people expect reaction. Instead, I accepted an invitation from a women's financial forum in Boston. The topic was estate planning and late-life power dynamics. I did not pitch my story. I simply told it. I spoke about exclusion disguised as concern, about favoritism framed as practicality, about how women over 50 are often erased politely with smiles and legal language. The room was silent. Then the questions came. One woman asked how I knew when to stop trusting. Another asked how I found the courage to confront. Another asked how to protect herself before it happened. I answered honestly, documentation is not distrust, I said. It is clarity. Silence is not dignity when it costs you everything. And revenge is not about hurting others. It is about refusing to disappear. The talk was recorded, shared, watched. The columnist emailed me days later asking for comment. I declined. Instead, Judith sent a letter, cease and desist, with attachments, emails, timelines, proof. The article was quietly retracted. The whispers stopped. Leonard passed away 3 months later, peacefully. No drama, no reconciliation scene. Just the quiet end of a man who had spent his final years learning that power is fragile when built on exclusion. I attended the funeral, not in black, but in navy. I sat near the back. Claire nodded at me once. Matthew did not look up. When the service ended, I walked out alone into the sunlight. I felt no triumph. I felt complete, because revenge had never been my goal. Truth was, and truth once spoken, clearly, does not need to be defended again. The final chapter would not be about them. It would be about what came after. I chose myself fully, without apology, without permission. And that is where the real story begins. After Leonard's funeral, people expected me to disappear. That is what widows are supposed to do when the story no longer revolves around a man. Fade quietly. Become a footnote, a before. Instead, something unexpected happened. I became visible. The weeks after the service were filled with letters. Not condolences, confessions. Women I had never met wrote to me after hearing my talk in Boston, after reading fragments of the story that circulated privately when the article was pulled. They told me about Thanksgiving dinners where they were seated at the far end of the table, about adult children who managed finances for their own good, about wills rewritten while they were still alive, still married, still breathing. I read every letter, and slowly, deliberately, I understood that what I had lived through was not rare. It was systemic, a quiet pattern of exclusion that thrived on women being polite, trusting, and tired. So I did something Leonard would never have predicted. I started a consulting practice. Not therapy, not advocacy in the dramatic sense. Practical, precise guidance. I worked with lawyers, financial planners, and women over 50 who wanted to understand where their power actually lived. We reviewed documents. We asked uncomfortable questions. We corrected assumptions before they hardened into betrayal. Word spread quickly. One afternoon, Judith stopped by my office, smiling in that way that meant she had news. "The buyer's board wants you," she said, for what I asked, to advise on governance. They realized too late what happens when one voice is removed without scrutiny. I accepted. The irony was not lost on me. The same company that had once benefited from my exclusion now relied on my clarity. Claire tried to call me during this time. Once. I let it go to voicemail. She did not leave a message. Matthew sent an email months later. Short, apologetic, uncertain. I did not reply. Not because I was angry, because closure does not require participation from the person who caused the harm. On Thanksgiving, 2 years after the Christmas photo that started everything, I hosted dinner in my apartment by the river. Not large, not performative. 8 women, all over 55. All with stories that mirrored pieces of mine. We cooked together. We laughed. We talked openly about money, about family drama, about betrayal and boundaries, and the strange freedom that comes when you stop trying to be included by people who benefit from your absence. One woman raised her glass. "To choosing ourselves," she said. We drank to that. Later that night, after everyone left, I stood by the window, watching the water move steadily past the dock, just as it had the day Leonard asked to rewrite his will. I felt no bitterness, only certainty. I had not lost a family. I had escaped a system that required my silence, and the final truth settled gently but firmly in my chest. Exclusion only works when you accept it. Today, I am 63 years old. I wake up without anxiety. I drink my coffee slowly. I choose my days instead of bracing for them. The consulting practice grew into something larger than I ever intended. I now work with women across the country, many of them grandmothers who were quietly pushed aside, told they were difficult for asking questions, ungrateful for wanting clarity. They come to me scared. They leave informed. That is the difference power makes. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how far it went, if I wish I had handled things more gently, if revenge was worth the cost. I always answer the same way. I did not seek revenge. I sought accuracy. Revenge implies excess. What I did was proportionate to the harm done. I reclaimed what was taken. I corrected the record. I refused to be erased politely. And karma did the rest. Leonard's children lost the control they abused. The family narrative collapsed under its own dishonesty. The woman who replaced me vanished when accountability arrived. The structures built on exclusion could not sustain themselves. That is not cruelty. That is consequence. If you are listening to this, and something in it feels uncomfortably familiar, let me tell you this clearly. You are not imagining it. You are not too old to demand fairness, and you are not wrong for refusing to disappear quietly. Document everything. Trust your perception. Ask the questions that make people uncomfortable. And remember this, sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply refusing to accept a version of your life that was written without your consent. If this story resonated with you, please like this video. Share your thoughts in the comments. I read them. And subscribe for more stories about betrayal, justice, karma, and women who reclaim their power later in life. Because this was my story, and it might be the beginning of yours.